Good evening and welcome. I'm Jeannie Long, Executive Director of Chicago Collections Consortium. As shared, tonight's program will be recorded and will be posted on CCC's website for additional viewing as well. We're excited tonight to be in conversation with Ryan Chester, author of Chicago Reflected, a skyline drawing from the Chicago River, a remarkable book and capture of our city. We're pleased to present tonight's program in partnership with the Chicago Architecture Biennial. Please check out the Chicago Architecture Biennial for a complete listing of their programs that continue until February 2024. Also, we are hosting in partnership with Chicago Friends of the River, who since 1979 have been working hard to improve the health of the Chicago River system for the benefit of people, plants, and animals. Please go to the website to learn more and actually get involved. Before we begin, if you're joining us for the first time tonight, Chicago Collections Consortium is a consortium of libraries, museums, and cultural organizations, all working together for the preservation and promotion of Chicago history and culture. We share our collections through our Explore portal, which provides free and open access to member archival collections. We'd like to begin our program tonight with Chicago Collections Land Acknowledgement Statement, which reads, Chicago Collections acknowledges and is grateful for the Native peoples who laid the foundation for the city of Chicago and for the indigenous nations that reside in Chicago today. When you visit our member organizations and when you experience Chicago outdoor spaces, we invite you to join in offering respect and gratitude to the many indigenous peoples that reside in the Chicagoland region, as well as their ancestors. I'd like to thank CCC's donors shown here, whose generous support allows us to host unique free programming, like this one being offered tonight, in addition to supporting Explore Chicago Collections portal. I'd also like to add that Chicago Reflected was supported by a grant from one of CCC's great friends and supporters, the Driehaus Foundation. We invite you to check out CCC's website to see a complete listing of upcoming programming. I know our conversation tonight will go by quickly, so please know we hope to set aside time for questions, and those can be directed to the Q&A. So welcome, Ryan, and thank you so much for making time for our conversation tonight. Congratulations on the release of the book, Chicago Reflected, a skyline drawing from the Chicago River, which is truly amazing, but also is this, unique capture, as I mentioned, of our city, but also includes a wonderful essay by Thomas Dyja. So Ryan, in addition to being practicing architecture here in Chicago, I know you also teach at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, but this book certainly celebrates your incredible skill as an artist and really celebrates the medium of drawing. So I want to dive right in, and can you share what prompted you to take on this program?
Yes. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Jeannie. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak here tonight. I will be happy to answer questions as I go through the presentation and at the end as well. Getting to your question, Jeannie, what prompted me to do this drawing is it's a kind of long story over the history of my career and getting into architecture. Is the idea of drawing by hand is something very important to me. It's the reason I became an architect. And over time, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, I realized that my passion for drawing is as strong as ever. And in the winter months when I can't draw outside, I was looking for a large project, and nothing could be larger than drawing something at this scale. So it really seemed natural to me to try to create something like this. And so I can jump straight into my presentation and get a little bit more into the details of how I came to create this drawing and the book itself. So hopefully everyone can see the screen. I can, first of all, start off by saying thanks again to the Chicago Collections Consortium, the Architecture Biennial, and the Friends of the Chicago River, who are gracious in their support for projects like this and others, bringing to light some of the more important pieces along the river and architecture in general. So I, of course, am very happy that they are involved in this and are teaming up with us to present it. So here, the book, as it is published today, it's almost available. I have a few advanced copies, but it'll be available on Amazon and the University of Chicago Press. It's a wonderful kind of coffee table book. It folds out into several sleeves from what was an original drawing of 55 feet long. And it's now been compressed into about 11 feet on two sides of an accordion style book. So just starting off a little bit about myself. I grew up in Milwaukee and I went to school at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where I'm now teaching as an adjunct professor. I graduated in 2005 and then went on to New York for a few years before then going to find an opportunity in London before coming back to the Midwest and being here in Chicago since 2011. So during all of my experiences, as wonderful as they are, they each taught me something about the profession, and I never lost that desire to continue drawing, as I had always had that passion within me. And every office taught me one way or another that architecture is really multifaceted. In some cases, you'll learn something about architecture that you never really realized existed, but in most cases, I gravitate towards those pieces of architecture where I can represent things graphically. And so coming back now, I'm working at JGMA here in Chicago, and I have a great opportunity to draw on a daily basis, which I'm really grateful for. So like I mentioned, drawing has been a passion of mine for a very long time. And this is actually the oldest drawing that I still have in my possession from 1992, when I was either 11 or 12 years old. There are older drawings, but I don't have them any longer. Who knows where they are? But I believe that this drawing and others like it were drawn from encyclopedias. When I was in elementary school or middle school, there weren't computers like they are now. And so for younger people, it might come as a surprise that there actually were encyclopedias in classrooms. And if you wanted to draw something, the best opportunity you would have to see other things outside of your world would be to open up that encyclopedia. And so you can see here, the Milwaukee River is actually featured on the lower right-hand corner. So a kind of full circle from this image of Milwaukee to Chicago reflected.
It's impressive early on.
Yeah, well, some things I guess never change.
Yes.
Right? So as I mentioned, I'm lucky enough to work at a firm now that really appreciates the things that I bring in terms of drawing. And so at my office, where I'm currently sitting, one side of my office, I have kind of lucky enough to have a partially enclosed office. So one wall of that little workspace that I have features all of these small 1 or 2 hour drawings, which are what we call archive drawings. So these are images that I create once a week so that the office can then post them to their social media page and kind of highlight things, primarily unbuilt projects. And then on the opposite wall, there are sketches that are actually in progress development of projects we have in the office, from concept designs to exterior wall details, a lot of different ways of working out designs throughout the design process. So I sit within a kind of semi-enclosed room, and drawings kind of surround me. From the time I was in college
Basically you're in career heaven then.
Yes. Anytime that I can really explore architecture through drawing, that's really what I want to be doing. Mm-hmm. So some people don't even pick up a pencil, don't even have one. They go straight to the computer. I'm quite the opposite. So, and up until 2017, the only time I really drew outside of work was when I would travel internationally. And so this on screen is an example of some of those sketches I did roughly late 90s. I started doing this until 2017. This was it, outside of work. Small sketchbook internationally. Or like when I lived in London, I did quite a bit of drawing there. Some of these are from that time. In 2017, at the office I was working at the time, a group of 3 young architects joined, and they started a group called the Sketch Club, where once a week we would all, as whoever was interested, would take their 1-hour lunch break and go out into the city and sketch just around whatever. It didn't have to be a theme or anything, just we would pick a location, everybody would go there and sketch. And so these are the first 9 of that series. So from 2017, the summer, the lower right-hand corner is the Wrigley building where I had worked. And then subsequent weeks, as you go up the page here, you could see some of the other drawings. So there's nothing very special about these. They're just 45-minute to 1-hour drawings. You just sit there, enjoy the summer, the warmth, and then that's the end of the drawing until the next week. But of course, in Chicago, we don't get endless summer. So we have 6 months of probably warm enough weather and then 6 months of not so warm. So your hand probably won't feel quite as comfortable half of the year. So I didn't really want to stop. You know, this drawing, I didn't want to just make it a summertime thing. So I started drawing out the window. And these are drawings that I did out the window from the Wrigley building during my lunchtime. Some of them looking out towards the horizon, others looking down here at the river, Michigan Avenue and the Apple Store, or the Bridge House, also looking out over Michigan Avenue. Or more recently, I even went to my wife's office, who she's also an architect, and I drew overlooking Millennium Park. So during that time, I was kind of getting hard pressed to find spaces to draw outside of. I was kicked out of some places, you know, public buildings don't, or I should say non-public buildings, such as office buildings, don't really appreciate a guy showing up with a pencil and just sitting there for an hour. So within the base of the Wrigley building, there is a cafe, and I spent 3 weeks there, 1 hour each time. Just, again, nothing too glamorous about these drawings, but over the course of 3 weeks, I drew from looking out towards the left, second week, and then towards the right. And so when you put these 3 drawings together, you see a kind of compilation panoramic view.
And Ryan, was at this point the idea for the book, was
exactly.
that like percolating? Okay.
So this is where I thought, wow, if I could do this in 3 weeks, winter's 6 months, so wow, I could probably get quite a long drawing if I were able to do this for 6 months. And then I looked at the map and realized, okay, if I started from the lakefront and worked my way south, past Bertrand Goldberg's River City, I should be able to come up with something pretty big and special. So I set off to think about how I could actually do this. I was able to buy a 100-foot long scroll of very low quality paper. This is the kind of paper that you would get out of a plotter. It's bond paper, really low quality that isn't meant to last long, but it was the only kind of paper that I could find at the scale that I needed. And then I thought about how to make it more rational. What if I just did 1 foot of drawing every week and said that 1 foot is 1 block? Because Chicago is a very gridded place. It's easy to kind of understand how far I would have to draw every week. And after thinking about that, I realized another project that I had known of for some time was Manhattan Unfurled by Matteo Pericoli. He did the same idea for a long drawing around Manhattan. So his is, obviously Manhattan is quite a bit longer than my project was, but his is a 26-mile long drawing. I believe at a smaller scale, but nevertheless very impressive. And I've been fascinated by this project for a long time. He had done this project actually published right before 9/11. So as you can see from the image on the left, this is from 2001, the image with the World Trade Center. And then 10 years later, the New Yorker magazine asked him to do another view of that same spot. And so he did the drawing with World Trade Center then under construction in 2011. And you can probably start seeing some similarities between his drawing and mine. I actually reached out to Matteo asking him all sorts of questions and telling him I'm doing this. And
I was going to ask that. And
he now lives in Italy. He used to live in New York and was an architect with Richard Meyer's office. And he has since moved back to Turin in the north of Italy. And I've been in communication with him a little bit, telling him this is coming, but he hasn't been the most responsive person. But again, this is the kind of full drawing in miniature. The first year that I did it for 6 months was the top drawing on the south and east side. And then I flipped and did the opposite side, the west and north, and that's the drawing on the bottom. So I can just walk through some of these nuances of the drawing. There are some things that might come as a surprise, especially if you open up the book, you buy it, you take a look, you flip through the pages, it might just appear like a photograph that's just been copied and just a long version that doesn't end. But it's a fantasy. This whole idea of this drawing, it could never be recreated this way from photographs. And I like to think about it as if you were to cut the river in half, cut through the bridges so you can see the innards of the bridge, and then you would have to push the entire river bank about a half a mile away from you to see each building as though it's perfectly vertical. Because if you would just take pictures of these buildings, they would all appear as though they're vanishing towards the sky. Because they're so tall, you would never be able to see them like this.
Well, it's really kind of, as you had stated, your vision, and especially, I'm sure you'll go into this, some of the unique elements that you've added that historically are no longer there, but also it's kind of like the dissection and autopsy, so to speak, too, of the skyline as well from different angles. So yeah, walk us through.
Yeah. So it's a snapshot in time. Like you mentioned, it's a fantasy. There is some history to it, but it's also this drawing, at least this section of it, has been done already for nearly 3 years. And things have changed. It's a living city. Things are always in progress. And you'll see some cranes along the river here. And if I started this drawing now, there would be several more buildings along the river that I didn't get to because they just simply weren't there at the time. So like I mentioned earlier, each bridge is cut in sections so you can start seeing all the beams and girders within. I'm highlighting here in the drawing some of those new constructions that didn't exist at the time I drew it, or other buildings that I decided to take liberties on. And one of the first lessons that I learned was all my planning that went into this drawing. There was one little snafu, and it happened about 2 weeks in, and that's in reference to the St. Regis, which is here by a studio gang built in 2020. Just as I was drawing it, it was just about complete, but not quite. And so this slide is showing the original drawing, the scroll that now currently lives in my basement and can't see the light of day, is actually drawn with the stubby version of the St. Regis. You can see compared to the one that's in Chicago reflected today, the proportions are different. And that's because I had stuck to this idea of 1 foot equals 1 city block. And because I did that, I ran out of real estate. My paper wasn't tall enough in order to get this building the way it was meant to be in proportion. And because it wasn't totally enclosed yet, I drew it as though the renderings that Jeannie Gang's office provided. So there's this kind of lattice work. You could see 2 sections of it at the base. After the building was built and I had an opportunity to go back and fix the proportions of this for the book, I realized that only one of those 2 lattice sections actually got built. So I was able to go back and undo that second section. So this was a decision I made. In hindsight, maybe it would have been better to keep the other lattice like the original design showed it, but just fix the height. So this is a kind of learning experience for me. I learned to always base the drawing off of the worst case scenario and work from that rather than stick to some arbitrary 1 foot equals 1 city block.
Well, an artistic license
Yes.
as well.
So I'll always know if someone has an original copy of this because it will have the stubby version of the St. Regis. So I don't think there's too many out there, but I'll always know because it'll look like that. I tried to include as many boats as would normally transverse the river today. And so you'll see dozens of different boats. And I don't believe any of them repeat. I tried to find as many types as possible. Up until the point that I got to the Kemper building, which ironically is no longer the Kemper building because its sign has been removed, I realized up until then I had a few signs on some of these buildings, but when I got here, I thought, I'm going to stop this because signs change and there's other signs on the river that I don't want to draw. And so from this point, and if you're familiar with the river, you know what's around this building, I decided to stop. And it's a good thing I did because even now, only 3 years after I drew this, the Kemper is no longer. So it would have just been a sign that blocked part of the building and it's no longer relevant. One of these fantasy ideas that I spoke about earlier was that it could never be captured this way from photographs. And architects know a lot about horizon lines and vanishing points. And here you can see this note saying multiple vanishing points. So up along the river, it's quite simple to say that one building is just next to another that's across the street. But as you go back, I wanted to make the drawing three-dimensional, so you actually see buildings in the distance. And so if you can see my cursor, you can see there are two buildings back here, and those two are actually 1 block away from these. But because of every block having its own set of vanishing points, they appear as though they're very far apart. And so this is part of that fantasy. I wanted a three-dimensional drawing, but in order to make it work, I had to kind of modify reality in this way. So each bridge is kind of its own little vignette, and then you stitch them together to find so many different points in the distance. Another kind of unusual little novelty of the drawing is all along I had been drawing these bridges that are cut, rising as though they're coming out of the page from the low point in the left, rising up to the right. And then I realized when I got to the curve of the river where the main branch meets the south branch, I wanted to make it appear as though those buildings were building up in scale, a kind of optical illusion. So 333 Wacker Drive is at the confluence of the main branch, the north and south. And so I tried with varying degree of success to alter the geometry of the bridge. So instead of just coming out from the bottom left to the upper right, they started changing. So every block, the bridge actually is changing its orientation. And then I got to Franklin, which is the bridge just to the left of 333 Wacker Drive. And this is the only bridge that is not working on the grid. It's a diagonal bridge. So I tried my best to make this seem like the bridges were opening up on both sides as you get to the curve of the river. But the Franklin Bridge messed me up. And it's kind of halfway in between.
With you.
Yeah. So it kind of looks like it's somewhere in between. It's not a nice clean break between the orientation of its neighboring bridges. So this is a kind of nuance. I had to flip the orientation of the bridge, and it's because of that curve. The Bank of America Tower was actually complete when I drew this, but I thought it looked more interesting under construction. And so that's why you can see it here. And some of the summaries of this book are saying that I started the project as soon as COVID began. But the truth is, I started it before COVID began. And I'll always remember the Civic Opera House is the point on the drawing where I had to take it home. This is March 29, 2020. And I remember drawing part of it in the office where the scroll had lived. And then from this point, everything else, like I would draw a line through the center of the Civic Opera building. And from that point, everything else was drawn in my house. So that building has special COVID kind of memories for me. Because, I mean, so much changed in our lives. And this project after that point became a kind of reconnection with the city I could no longer visit. You know, every day I would go to Chicago, into the Loop or Wrigley Building, and I was always involved. I was present. And since that moment, this project was my connection to the city, to downtown. So from that point, we're now at home, drawing on my drafting table, and other little details here. Often the bridges are coming out at an angle, but they're actually lowered bridges. And here with the sailboats coming, you can see now that they're lifting up. That's another little detail. I didn't have the same problem with the Willis and Sears Tower as I did with the St. Regis because it's a block off of the river. So I used the kind of forced perspective to make it appear as though it's tall, but not so tall as that I wouldn't be able to fit it. I was able to kind of squeeze it down because I could say that the perspective, that building being in the distance, made it feel a little bit shorter. So luckily I didn't have the same problem as I did with the building right up against the river like St. Regis is.
Brian, I wanted to ask you though, losing that, I guess, source of real-time inspiration and being at your desk or at home, in many cases, kitchen table, wherever. I mean, was that really hard, that transition, or were you so in your mind connected to the drawings you were working from?
It actually was easier. And I say that it was easier because if the drawing lives in the office, I was only able to work on it at lunch if I had nothing else going on. So I had 1 hour per day max. And that would be, I tried not to do this every day because people would think I was, slacking off if I'm drawing all the time. But when I was able to take it home, I could work on it at night.
In the evenings. And
I had more flexibility. So it was actually better that way. I had all my photos. I had Google Earth, Street View. And so all the things that I would normally be drawing from didn't change. It's just I had more flexibility with time.
And you didn't have to worry about the weather.
Yes. Well, this drawing could never, ever go outside.
Yeah.
It's not the kind of thing you can do on site. It's a total controlled environment. You can't let anything touch this. I don't even want to take it out of my house. I just leave it somewhere locked up. So coming down here now we're getting towards the April 2020. This is the southern end of the South Branch and I highlight here the Cooper. This is the only drawing on the river that I worked on as an architect in my experience. So this building has special meaning to me because I worked on it for years at Perkins and Will. And at this point, at the southern end, after River City, I put the drawing away. It was the summer, so my 6 months of drawing had ended, and I thought, well, that was fun. That was a project. I completed a personal challenge. But then, of course, November of that year comes around, and I think, well, I need another project. And so I turned around and went back the other way. So the same idea, again, roughly 6 months or 24 weeks, just from the other side of River City and going back towards the lake. And so this is actually where I started integrating a few pieces of Chicago history, because I always like to say that the Chicago River is an amazing architectural showcase, but there's actually a lot of not so nice buildings on it as well as nice buildings. So in this case, I recreated something that's no longer there, and that's the Union Station Concourse building. It was demolished in 1969. If you were to look at it today, there's a dark few-story box of glass and a maybe 30-story white box. Nothing really sets them apart. And I've always been fond of this building, which is no longer there. And I really wish it were still there, because architecturally, it looks fantastic. It's beautiful. And also the experience that you have within Union Station is terrible. Let's be honest. It's not a very nice experience, aside from the main hall, which is still there. So you see that I was able to tear down in some way those two buildings that are existing today, replace it with this little temple building, and then you can actually see the existing head house, which we all know today, that's still there. Had I drawn the two buildings that are there, you would probably not see any of that beautiful Great Hall and head house that are there today. So that was something, and I want to give credit to, had I known Chicago Collections Consortium was available to me when I drew this, I probably would have actually drawn more of the history of Chicago, because unfortunately, I didn't know enough about the history to incorporate more things like this, which I would love to have done.
There's still time
Yeah, the second edition, I'm going to patch it all with so many crazy old stuff.
with an overlay,
Yes. So as we continue north now, we're on the South Branch still. The sailboats again, as you saw on the opposite side of the river, are the same place here. And then I didn't highlight this before, but the Wells and Lake Street both have the L running across them, and I drew the L as though it's about to hit the water, but you can see the trains are both working on Wells and Lake. And then here, right across the river from 333 Wacker Drive, I'm doing the opposite. This is where the North Branch splits and goes just beyond this boat. So you can actually see I'm kind of playing the opposite trick where these buildings are now looking as though they're shrinking in size. So this, there's actually the River Cottages by Harry Weiss way down in the corner there. This is, I'm kind of making it smaller than it actually is in order to give the illusion that that North Branch is splitting. And then as we continue Wolf Point, the sales force was nothing more than a crane when I drew it. And today it's probably the top, beyond even the top of this red box, totally topped out, occupied. So this is another example of that, the living city. A few years from now, there'll be other buildings that obviously have come up. So this is, I'm looking at the past, but drawing the present at the time I drew it. And then another piece of history that I decided to include here was the disaster of the Eastland. And some of you on the call might be familiar with this, but in 1915, this giant steamer capsized in the river, killing over 800 people. In my research of trying to include as many boats that would go on the river as possible, I came across this and I thought it's appropriate that I would pay respect to this because, as I mentioned to Jeannie earlier, a lot of people, even Chicagoans, don't know this happened or even where it happened. And so I included it just so that people can appreciate what happened there and understand that it happened and kind of just have it in their memory. It should not be forgotten because so many died there. And it's ironic that the Reed Murdoch building is the only building on the drawing that's on the river that still exists. And it was built 1 year before that happened. So it's very ironic that this happened in front of this building. And that's the only building that witnessed it.
And so close to the shoreline, which is even
right
more tragic.
On the shore. Yeah, that's right. So this was after I had the mistake with the St. Regis. When I started drawing this, I drew a silhouette of Trump Tower because I knew that was going to be the worst case, tallest building. And I had it on my desk and on a piece of trace the entire time I drew this as a reminder, this is how big it's going to be. So every other building has to be somehow proportioned off of that. So if you were to look at the original drawing, you would actually see that all of the buildings are smaller on this side, as opposed to the south and east side of the river, because they were artificially enlarged on those sides in order to, I didn't worry so much about the height of St. Regis, so they were all larger. But here I made them all smaller, so I made sure that Trump would set the tone for the rest of them. The Centennial Fountain, again here on the right, I've included. This is the giant spray that comes across the river, and I think it's actually been broken or isn't functional.
I was going to say when it works. Yeah, it's been broken for some time.
Luckily, it works on my drawing. You know,
yes.
It's the joy of drawing. Anything's possible. I don't know if they're ever going to fix this. It seems like years that it's not been working.
I know there's some movement to try to get it fixed.
I'm always wondering, it's always funny when I would walk across the bridge and you see boats having to wait for it to turn off so that their crowds don't get wet. Here again, now this is right back where I started from on the opposite side, but because of the lock, which I decided to include on the north side, this side of the drawing is actually much longer, even though the scale is smaller. So you can see here that Ferris wheel at Navy Pier. The Chicago Harbor lock is open in this position. This is the west side of the lock. And so your boats would enter into the lock. And then finally, the end of this is showing the closed lock. So I don't recall exactly how I found what this thing actually looks like in section. But again, a lot of it could just be my whimsical imagination of what it looks like. but you can see the lower level of the water line here. And then as soon as you get to the lock, the water in Lake Michigan is higher. And I capped off the drawing with something that kind of brings it back to my upbringing and where I was raised, which is Milwaukee. There's a giant tall ship called the Dennis Sullivan. It was commissioned by a museum in Milwaukee in 2000. It spent its summers as a kind of classroom at Discovery World on the lake in Milwaukee. And as I was making this presentation, I thought I should probably check to make sure I get the name spelled correctly. So I Googled it, and it turns out that the ship in 2022 was sold to a company in Boston. So it no longer calls Milwaukee home in the summer. But it was at the time I drew this.
Sailed away.
Yeah. And so once this thing was done, I actually had no intention of publishing seriously until it was done. And then my wife and I talked, well, I could just put this in the basement and say, well, that was fun and call it a day.
Really,
Well,
Ryan, I have to stop you there. Through
Yeah.
this whole process, it wasn't the end game was to get it published. It was
wasn't serious. In fact, after the first year where I did the first 6 months, it didn't even cross my mind. And only after I started the second half was it like, okay, when I finish, I might want to think about publishing, but I didn't know how to go about it. So I actually contacted some companies that would deal with art museums, and I asked them, what would it take for you to digitize this thing? And they said, yeah, we could do it. It would cost you $10,000. So I thought, okay, I'm gonna have to get a little bit more creative with this. And so my wife and I bought the latest iPhone, and we set it on a board between two chairs like this, and I took hundreds and hundreds of photos and in Photoshop stitched them all together. So that was not the most fun part of the project, I could say, but it was necessary because it was the only way that I could get it out to someone in case they were interested in publishing. And I wanted to print it too so that I could carry it around. Like I said, it's drawn on really bad paper. And so I don't want anyone to touch it. I don't want anyone to see it because it's just going to get ruined. And if it's ruined, it's a lot of time wasted. And so I went to a print shop and I thought, I'll just sit here. And then as it comes out, I'll roll it up nice and neat. But they print so fast that it ended up going all over the floor, just like you see in the sketch, which is quite something to see. A drawing.
My heart stopped.
Yeah. But luckily it's a print, so I didn't care. Let it go crazy. As I mentioned earlier, it's a living drawing. It's a snapshot in time. It can be patched, and like I did
And your
with St. Regis.
snapshot in time too. Mhm.
Yes, that is a snapshot, and it could also be patched. So if there was ever something that happened along the river and I wanted to update my drawing, I could take a look, such as these buildings, which have been built since I drew it, and patch it just like I did on St. Regis. So it could constantly be updated if the need were there. And this is how that print that came out of the copy machine was presented to the people, the board members at the University of Chicago Press. It was just rolled out onto their conference table. And you can actually see the woman at the end here is holding it so it doesn't fall, because this is only about a quarter of it, of the whole drawing. So this was him pitching the idea to the board members saying, maybe we want to publish this. And I want to stop and just say thank you to the University of Chicago Press for taking a chance on this, because this book, again, even after I started looking to get it published, I failed time and time again, because I reached out to several other publishing companies and they all passed. And it was only until I got to the University Press here that they said yes. So I just am eternally grateful. When I look at the book, I often think that the drawing is part of it, but the publication and the format that it was presented in is just as important. It's really beautiful the way they put it together. In some other presentations, people asked, well, what's next? And so here I'm thinking about, as I went through the drawing and recreated the concourse building at Union Station, I started thinking about these drawings of buildings that are no longer with us. We had such an incredible collective city, and we still do, but there's too many great buildings that are no longer on the cityscape. Such as, this is the image I actually referred to when I drew that building at Union Station. And that's what it looks like today. So you can probably understand why I chose to draw what I did when you see this. And so then I started this new project of recreating historic buildings as though they weren't destroyed or demolished. And there are many in the city that lots of people don't even realize or were ever there. So the Wells Street station was built. This is now merchandise mart. So I'm not saying one is better than the other. It's just fascinating to see what was there. And this is kind of looking through the L station on Wells Street and what was there. Or one more people might be familiar with is the old Federal Building, which is now where Mies van der Rohe's Federal Plaza is now, with the Calder's flamingo sculpture. And I'm not advocating one is better than the other. I just like to see, as you walk by, people might be like, well, that was there. I know these buildings, but that one isn't there. It's kind of a reminder. And so this is kind of my next project. I'm every week in the winter drawing another landmark that has been destroyed in its contemporary context.
Well, I know you'll find Explore Chicago Collections portal a great aid as you look back for these buildings.
Yes.
So
I do have to do a lot of digging, and it'll be great to connect with Chicago Collections, because so much of my time is looking for the best image of a project, and it takes time to find a perspective that works. And so I just want to once again thank all of these people that really contributed to the project, all these people at the press, the Dree House, as you had mentioned, Jeannie. I'm so grateful for the contribution that they gave, as well as a smaller gift, but still welcomed and needed, from my alma mater, where I'm teaching at UWM. The Architecture Center has also been an advocate for this project, and I appreciate everything they've done. They were the first ones to endorse the project. When I was shopping for a publisher, they wrote a very beautiful letter encouraging others to join me. Thomas's beautiful words at the beginning of the essay, I thank him as well. And for the reviewers that provided blurbs at the back cover of the book, I really appreciate all of their kind words as well. So that's the book. It's available on Amazon and at the University of Chicago Press. And I thank everyone for being a part of this, listening on your Tuesday night. I appreciate your attention, and we can open it up if anyone has questions.
We do have some questions, and it is an incredible book, and I have it proudly displayed in my office as it fans out to the skyline. And it's, as I said, it's frankly a work of art. So
thank you.
No, thank you.
And it's the credit of the drawing is great, but also the press did such a beautiful job with it. I was so happy when I opened it for the first time. It's just fantastic. It's truly, yeah, it's very elegant. And also a couple side notes too. I loved how it's again, back to the reflection of Chicago's weather, that white sky that, was purposely chosen, because that's typically our weather, with no sunshine and us making those images pop against the white skyline. But we've got several questions already in the Q&A. One being, I'm fascinated as to the interplay between text and drawings. What was the thought process behind selecting Thomas to write the essay, introduction to the book, or did Thomas reach out to you, or how was that arranged? So originally the essay was, when I went to the press and was pitching the book to different publishers, I had another person in mind, a friend of mine that lives in New York. And because the press is an academic press, they have their opinions on lots of things. And Thomas was actually brought to me in exchange for the friend of mine, because my friend is actually from New York and he's an architectural critic, whereas Thomas is more of a historian and has roots in Chicago. So he also has name recognition, having done some other books of Chicago. So he was brought to me, and I met him once, both with the publisher and Thomas, at the roof of the London House restaurant in a very, very hot summer day, which was appropriate. And yeah, he's been phenomenal. I was so moved by his words when I first read them, but yeah, he was brought to me. Yeah, the essay is very well done. Another question, are there any chance of updating your sketch in the future? I would love to do that. And in fact, I was at the Printers Row Lit Fest a few months ago, and I asked the publisher, "Hey, you want to do a second edition sometime? I could add all of these buildings that aren't there in my drawing." And he said, "It's unlikely that this would be the case because the creating this book is extremely difficult and expensive, time consuming. In fact, it was printed in Hong Kong and someone had to actually physically by hand glue the pages all together. And so I would be willing to do a second edition, and it might have to be digital, but yes, I would love to add all of these buildings that I didn't get to."
Um, so you had talked about this, but a little bit touched upon it, but what were some of the discoverables for you in terms of in the creation of this?
Things that I discovered aside from, so for the Eastland, that was certainly, I mean, I knew about it, but not really where it capsized, where the tragedy happened, how big the boat was. I could hardly even fit it. I had to kind of skew it so much in my drawing just to get it to fit. And so that's another trick of perspective. But I honestly think that because I stuck so strongly to the photographs I had in front of me, this is probably one of my regrets. I didn't do as much research as to what was there. And so the Eastland is the only one that I really focused on. And I knew about the concourse building, so I knew that I wanted to draw that. But there aren't that many other discoveries that that I did at the time and I would want to do now. Yeah.
And you knew going into it, you were going to include those early on.
Only when I started drawing that side of the river. So, but yes, I knew that the Eastland was coming. You know, I basically had 6 months to think about this thing as I was getting closer to the time I would draw it. So I knew that I was going to include those because I had too much time to think about it.
And maybe this isn't a fair, I guess it's a statement / question, but I do think Chicago has, in many cases, incorporated the old and the new along the river of building. I'm trying to think of, the Encyclopedia Britannica building of, maintaining,
Oh yeah, that's
yes.
The Britannica building, which is the Reed Murdoch.
Yes.
That's this one. It says Britannica at the top.
But I do think, what's we're proud of it in terms of the continued advancements is displayed, but also on the level of historic preservation too. I mean, needs to continue, and but I think as a city we're have moved a bit of that mark as well. So
yes, there's certainly buildings that have been destroyed and sadly shouldn't, or I would hope wouldn't have been destroyed, and that's part of my next project. So in a way, the Eastland and the concourse building are examples of things that Chicago once had and lost for one reason or another. Totally different examples here, but I think that the Great Fire 1871 destroyed virtually all of the center of the city. It was rebuilt and a lot of beautiful buildings were rebuilt, but then over time we actually demolished that whole city that was rebuilt. So in a way, there's a tragedy, and then we chose to erase a lot of other great things at the same time. So it's like two different disasters.
And you had also mentioned in terms of, next steps in the next book, but Chicago and your relationship to Milwaukee, but how Chicago was really your focus. I mean, and that draw and that love of the city skyline is, not to be mistaken. But looking at other cities in mind, what would be that next kind of?
I would love, like, I think about retirement because then I could do all of these things. I don't know if that'll ever be in the cards for me, but I would love to do this for Paris. It would be totally different because
so many curves in Paris.
It would be, but I could really zoom in because it's quite low all the way along the Seine, both sides. But then the Eiffel Tower would be the only thing that gives it the verticality. But you could really get into, if this seems like a detailed drawing, I feel like doing something of Paris would be just even twice, 3 times as detailed as this, because I could really get into each building with detail. That would be my goal. But
we're so pleased that you chose Chicago to concentrate and to get this out to us. So what advice do you have for other architects who have an interest in drawing and in the are more of, you know, as you had mentioned early on, the profession is more tech centric than ever before, but what advice do you have for those architects who are interested in continuing the work in true drawing?
I would say that if you're truly passionate about drawing by hand, you should never be discouraged by what you see other people doing. So had I listened or just followed the trend, I would be unremarkable in many ways, because I would drop all of this and just focus on what other people are doing, even though I know it has value. I would say find your passion as an architect, even architects at any age. Don't let the fad or the trend at the time dictate what you want to do. I think finding passion is the most important thing, because you can do incredible things if you're passionate about it. But if you're just there doing the 9 to 5 and then going home and not thinking about architecture, you might not produce something exceptional.
Well, your drawings in this book is truly an inspiration. I think it's just been, you know, a wonderful witness, as I said at the start of the program, you know, your vision, your artistic approach to a project like this, and just being able to share with us all that was involved as well. We have kind wishes from Ann Lazar that she shares. Congratulations, Ryan. The Driehaus Foundation is pleased to support the excellent project and your important work. So
thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. That concludes our program tonight. And again, thank you, Ryan. We look forward to staying in touch. We look forward to your work and being of service as it comes to your research efforts too. So thank you all for joining us.
All right. Thank you, everyone.